Imagine if your darkest thoughts didn't just haunt you. Imagine if they escaped, if they found someone, if they shaped a killer. What if the words you wrote in the shadows of your mind became someone else's blueprint for murder? Welcome to Midnight What Ifs, where we dive deep into what if history took a terrifying turn, blending real events with alternate timeline horror that'll keep you up long after the video ends. Tonight, we're exploring something truly chilling, a psychological horror rooted in one of Britain's most notorious cases. The Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, a name that still sends shivers through England. Between 1975 and 1980, this seemingly ordinary truck driver from West Yorkshire murdered at least 13 women. 13 lives snuffed out by a man who claimed divine voices commanded him, but the truth was far more human, far more disturbing. Sutcliffe's motivations were rooted in deep-seated misogyny, pathological hatred, and a twisted psyche that the police failed to stop for 5 long years. The case exposed societal blind spots, investigative failures, and the terrifying banality of evil hiding in plain sight. He was just a man, a neighbor, someone you might pass on the street without a second glance. But here's where our story diverges into the realm of alternate timeline horror. What if Sutcliffe's rampage wasn't born in isolation? What if there was a catalyst? What if that catalyst was you? Picture this, it's 1974 Leeds. You're a struggling writer, barely scraping by in a cramped flat that smells of damp and yesterday's tea. You're wrestling with your own demons, pouring your anger, your frustrations, your darkest observations about society into unpublished manuscripts that no one will ever read. Or so you think. Your words are raw, exploring the pathology of violence, the psychology of hatred, themes too dark for mainstream publishers. You write them anyway because they demand to be written. They feel too real. Then one night you meet him, a quiet truck driver at a local pub, just casual conversation. You mention your writing. He seems interested, unnervingly so. You don't think much of it, but weeks later you realize pages from your manuscript are missing. Conversations you had echo in newspaper reports of a brutal attack. Your fictional exploration of a killer's mind has become someone's reality. Your psychological study has become his motivation. This is your alternate timeline horror, grounded in realism and psychological terror, where you become the unwitting architect of a nightmare. If this hooks you, smash that like button right now. Subscribe for more deep dives into alternate history horror, share this with anyone who loves true crime and what if scenarios, and comment below. What would you do if your darkest ideas inspired a monster? But right now, as you sit in your dim flat, the weight of realization crushing down, there's a knock at the door. Heavy, deliberate. And outside your window, the fog rolls through the streets of Leeds, carrying with it something you can't quite name yet. Something that knows your name. The knock at the door turns out to be nothing. Just the landlord, Mr. Kershaw, demanding next week's rent early. Again, you mutter something about the check being in the post, close the door before he can argue, and lean against the peeling wallpaper, heart still pounding from the irrational jolt of fear. This is what 1974 Leeds does to you. Makes you jumpy. Makes you see shadows where there's only grime. Your flat is a cramped third-floor walk-up in Chapeltown, where the radiators clank but never quite heat, and the rain lashes against windows that haven't been properly sealed since the Blitz. Outside, the fog rolls thick and industrial, carrying the smell of coal smoke and something sour, something rotting in the alleys below. The whole city feels like it's holding its breath. The 3-day work week has everyone on edge, power cuts plunging neighborhoods into darkness at random, candles becoming currency. You've got a drawer full of them now, waxy soldiers waiting for the next blackout. The news doesn't help. Every broadcast is the same grim litany. IRA bombings down south, inflation spiraling, the economy in freefall, and closer to home, whispers, women attacked in the streets. Nothing concrete yet, nothing that makes the national papers, but enough to make people lock their doors earlier, walk faster through the fog. You're a writer, or you're trying to be. Freelance, which is a polite way of saying unemployed with aspirations. A few articles here and there for local rags, the kind of assignments that pay just enough to keep you in instant coffee and cigarettes. But the real work, the work that matters, lives in the notebooks stacked beside your typewriter. 3 of them now, filled with cramped handwriting that gets messier the deeper you go into the night. You tell yourself you're exploring the human condition. Alienation, rage, the pressure cooker of modern life that turns ordinary people into something else. You write about voices, not the supernatural kind, but the internal monologue that society beats into you. The relentless drum of expectation, failure, shame, the need to silence the chaos, to impose order on a world that refuses to make sense. Sometimes, late at night with a whiskey that's more tap water than spirit, you read back what you've written and feel a chill that has nothing to do with the broken heating. The words have a life of their own. They articulate things you didn't know you felt. A chilling empathy for people pushed to the margins, yes, but twisted with something darker. Control, punishment. The idea that some people, certain types of people, embody the chaos that needs to be eliminated. You never name who, you don't have to. The words know. It was 3 weeks ago when you first noticed someone else might be reading them. You'd been at the Gaiety, a pub on Roundhay Road where the beer is cheap and the clientele asks no questions. You'd gone to escape the claustrophobia of the flat, brought a notebook because you always do, scribbling observations between pints. Then you'd gotten into an argument with some bloke about the unions, left the notebook on the table while you went to take a piss, and when you came back it was gone. Just vanished. You'd searched everywhere, asked the barman, but nothing. A week later, it turned up in your postbox. No note, no explanation, just the notebook, pages slightly more worn as if someone had read them carefully, multiple times. You chalked it up to a good Samaritan maybe, until last Tuesday. Same pub, different notebook, this time clutched protectively in your hand, and then he approached. A man maybe your age, maybe younger, hard to tell in the dim light, stocky build, dark hair, thick beard, eyes that didn't quite meet yours but seemed to see everything anyway. He'd asked if you were the writer, voice low and oddly formal, like he'd rehearsed the question. You'd tensed, thinking he was about to complain about something you'd written, some article that pissed off the wrong person. But no, he'd said he'd found pages, your pages. Blowing down the street near Manningham, he'd said, and he'd read them. Found them interesting, very interesting. You remember the way he said that word. Interesting. Drawing it out, savoring it. You remember the chill of the pint glass in your hand, condensation running down like cold sweat. The smoke-filled air seemed to thicken as he spoke, his words echoing thoughts you'd never said aloud. He talked about society's hypocrisies, about women who walked the streets at night, about the voices that told people what was right and wrong, and how sometimes those voices got confused. You tried to laugh it off, said it was just fiction, just exploration, not meant to be taken literally. He'd nodded, smiled even, but his eyes stayed flat. Then he'd told you he was a truck driver. Long routes, mostly at night, lots of time to think. Too much time, maybe. Before you could respond, he'd drained his pint, thanked you for the conversation, and disappeared into the fog outside. You never even caught his name. Since then, you can't shake the feeling that your words have grown legs, that they're walking around out there without you, finding audiences you never intended. You've started reviewing your old drafts, the ones you thought were too raw to show anyone, spread across your floor like a case file. And that's when you notice the patterns. An entry from 6 months ago about a woman who represents everything wrong with modern permissiveness. A description of a hammer as an implement of order. Musings on Yorkshire moors as places where secrets stay buried. Then you see the dates of those headlines you've been avoiding, the attacks that the police aren't connecting yet but you can see the thread. The locations match places you've written about. The methods echo metaphors you've used. It's coincidence. It has to be. Writers explore dark themes all the time. It doesn't mean anything. But your hands shake as you gather the pages, and when you crumple the darkest one, the one that reads like a blueprint, you throw it in the bin beside your desk. You need to stop, need to pivot to lighter material. Romance, maybe, comedy, anything but this. You light a cigarette, try to steady your breathing, tell yourself you're being paranoid. The city's atmosphere is getting to you, that's all. Then you hear it, a rustle from the bin, paper moving. You tell yourself it's just the draft from the gap under the door, but you know that's not true because you stuffed a towel there hours ago. The rustle comes again, louder, and you force yourself to look. The crumpled page is unfurling, slowly, impossibly. And as it smooths itself against the metal rim, you see words you don't remember writing. New words. In handwriting that's almost yours, but not quite, the letters slightly heavier, the slant more aggressive. They form a sentence that makes your blood run cold, a sentence that sounds like a stranger's voice whispering directly into your ear, pulling you deeper into a web you never meant to weave. The words on that unfurled page read like a promise, or a threat, you can't quite decide which. They say the work continues through willing hands. You stare at them until your vision blurs, trying to convince yourself you wrote them during some late-night fugue state, some whiskey-soaked moment you can't remember. But the handwriting is wrong, just slightly. Like someone learned to forge your script but couldn't quite capture the way you cross your T's. You burn the page that night, watch it curl and blacken in the sink, and tell yourself that's the end of it. That's January 1975. By March, you know you were lying to yourself. The year grinds forward with the relentless bleakness that defines this era of Yorkshire. The economy is in freefall, unemployment rising like floodwater, and you're drowning with everyone else. The freelance work dries up completely. Editors stop returning your calls, so you do what desperate people do. You take whatever job you can get. A position opens at Haworth Mills. A textile factory on the outskirts of Bradford, night shifts because they pay slightly more, and because you've become nocturnal anyway, your sleep schedule wrecked by anxiety and the words that won't stop coming. The work is mind-numbing. Watching looms, checking for breaks in the thread, breathing air thick with cotton dust that coats your lungs like cobwebs. But it gives you time to think. Too much time. Your fellow workers are ghosts moving through the fluorescent haze, faces hollowed by the same desperation. Some of them are women, walking to the bus stop alone after the shift ends at 2 in the morning, collars turned up against the perpetual cold. You want to tell them to be careful, that something predatory is moving through these streets, but how do you explain a feeling? How do you articulate a dread that has no solid form yet? The strikes don't help. The power cuts plunge the factory into darkness for hours at a time, emergency lights casting everything in red. During those blackouts, the looms fall silent, and you can hear every breath, every footstep echoing in the vast space. It feels like waiting for something to happen. Then you start seeing your words, not in notebooks, not in drawers, out there in the world. The first time is at the Gaiety, that same pub where you met him. You're nursing a pint, trying to avoid conversation when you glance at the wall near the toilets. Someone scrawled graffiti in black marker, crude but deliberate. "The chaos must be silenced." That's your phrase, from a journal entry you wrote 8 months ago, locked in your desk drawer. You approach the wall like it might bite, trace the letters with shaking fingers. The ink is fresh, smudged slightly as if whoever wrote it was in a hurry, or excited. You ask the barman if he saw who did it. He shrugs. Lots of people come and go, could be anyone. But it's not anyone, it's specific, intentional. Over the next few weeks you find more. A page torn from something that looks like your handwriting, blown against a fence near Chapel Town. A phrase carved into a bus shelter. Order through purging, another one of yours. You start checking your flat obsessively, searching for signs of break-ins, but there's nothing. No forced windows, no disturbed locks. Either you're scattering these fragments in some dissociative state you can't recall, or someone has access to your innermost thoughts. Both possibilities terrify you equally. Your reflection becomes a source of morbid fascination. You spend too long staring at yourself in the mirror, tracing the lines that exhaustion has carved around your eyes, the way your mouth settles into a grim line even when you're not consciously frowning. Could you be doing this? Could there be another you, walking around at night, spray painting your private madness onto public walls? You've read about it, split personalities, fugue states, but that feels too easy. Too much like a horror story someone else would write. No, the truth is worse. The truth is that your words have found an audience of one, and he's taking them seriously. You see him again in April. There's a community meeting at St. James's Church Hall, organized by some local women's group demanding better policing, better lighting after a spate of attacks in Chapeltown and Manningham. The police aren't connecting them yet, or they're not saying if they are, but people are scared. You go because you feel compelled to, some sense of guilt you can't name driving you there. The hall is packed, tension thick enough to choke on. Women demanding action, men looking uncomfortable, defensive. And there near the back is him, the truck driver, bearded, expressionless, hands folded in his lap like he's at Sunday service. When the floor opens for comments, he stands. His voice is calm, measured, almost gentle. He talks about moral decay, about women who walk the streets at night bringing violence upon themselves, about the need to purge the night of certain elements to restore order. And then, and this is what makes your blood turn to ice, he quotes you, word for word, a passage from your unpublished story about a man driven to cleanse his city of corruption. He doesn't attribute it. Doesn't even seem aware that the words aren't his own. He speaks them with a fervor that makes several people in the audience shift uncomfortably, makes a few women get up and leave. You sit frozen, unable to breathe, unable to think. When he finishes, he sits down, catches your eye across the room, and nods, just once, an acknowledgement, a thank you. You stumble out before the meeting ends, gulping cold air that does nothing to steady you. The rain is coming down now, that fine Yorkshire drizzle that soaks through everything. You walk home in a daze, every shadow a reminder that your words might be walking too, carried in the mind of a man who believes them, who's acting on them, because that's what this is, isn't it? Those attacks the women were talking about, those aren't random. They're patterned, methodical. And if you let yourself think about it, really think about it, they align too perfectly with themes you've explored in your journals, locations you've described, methods you've metaphorized. Back at your flat, you spread out newspapers like evidence at a crime scene. You've been collecting them without really admitting why. 3 attacks so far reported in the back pages, dismissed as muggings or domestic incidents. But you see the thread, all women, all at night, all in areas you've written about as symbols of societal breakdown. You cross-reference dates with your own journal entries, and the alignment makes you sick. An attack in Chapeltown 2 weeks after you wrote about it as a place where boundaries dissolve. Another in Manningham, shortly after a passage about hidden impulses finding release in industrial shadows. Coincidence? Maybe, but you don't believe in coincidence anymore. You're not sleeping, can't sleep. Your mind won't stop cataloging every word you've ever written that could be interpreted as instruction rather than exploration. Every metaphor that could become literal in the wrong hands. Are you responsible? If you plant a seed, are you accountable for how it grows? The questions circle like vultures, and you have no answers that bring comfort. You consider burning everything. Every notebook, every draft, every scrap of paper with your handwriting on it. But what good would that do now? The ideas are already out there, already growing in soil you never intended to fertilize. When the letter arrives, slipped under your door while you're at the factory, you know before you open it. Know with the certainty of dread that's been building for months. The envelope is plain, no return address, your name written in careful script that's neither yours nor entirely unfamiliar. Inside, a single page. The handwriting matches that mysterious addition to your crumpled manuscript. The words are praise, effusive and chilling, thanking you for your inspirational insights. Telling you that your vision is being realized, that the work you started on paper is manifesting in flesh. It's unsigned, but you don't need a signature. You know who it's from. And as you read it again, hands trembling, you realize the true entanglement has only just begun to uncoil. The letter sits on your table for 3 days before you can bring yourself to touch it again. Those words, your vision is being realized, loop through your mind like a broken record, and you can't make them stop. Can't unhear them. By the time summer arrives in 1976, you've memorized every curve of that handwriting, analyzed every word choice, searched for some hint of irony or misunderstanding that would let you off the hook. There isn't one. He means it, every word. And that's when you start paying closer attention to the news, really paying attention, with the kind of focus that borders on obsession. The pattern emerges like a photograph developing in chemicals. 4 attacks now, possibly 5 depending on how you classify. The police are calling them separate incidents, different perpetrators, because how could one man be responsible for attacks spread across Leeds, Bradford, and Halifax? Different methods, they say, different victim types. But you see what they can't or won't, the thread connecting them. The locations are all places saturated with what you've written about as moral decay. The timing aligns with your darker periods of writing. And then, chillingly, the language. A detective quoted in the Yorkshire Post describes one scene as showing signs of someone trying to impose order on chaos. That's your phrase, exactly your phrase, from a journal entry you wrote in March. You tell yourself it's coincidence. The detective could have come up with those words independently. They're not that unique, except they are. You chose them specifically because they captured something you couldn't articulate any other way. The idea that violence could be a form of organization, a brutal filing system for a world that refused to make sense. And now a detective, a man trained to see patterns, is using your words to describe a crime scene. The implications make you feel like the floor is tilting beneath your feet. Your personal life hasn't helped. You've been unraveling in small, ugly ways that feel both inevitable and accelerating. The factory laid you off in May, citing economic conditions, but really because you become unreliable, showing up late, distracted, prone to staring into middle distance for hours. Your family, what little you have left, stopped calling after your mother died last autumn, and you didn't make it to the funeral, citing work you didn't actually have. The isolation should feel freeing, but instead it feels like drowning in slow motion. You're alone with your thoughts, and your thoughts have become dangerous company. The daydreams start around this time. Not dreams exactly, because you're awake, fully conscious, but vivid scenarios that play out with cinematic clarity. You imagine walking through Chapeltown at night, past the women standing in doorways, and feeling not lust but something colder, cleaner. The urge to silence them, to silence everything, to create a bubble of perfect quiet in a world that won't stop screaming. You clench your fists at your kitchen table, knuckles white, feeling the phantom satisfaction of imposing your will, of making something stop. Then you snap back to yourself, heart racing, and realize you've been sitting there for 20 minutes, tea gone cold, caught in a fantasy of control that horrifies and compels you in equal measure. Are these your thoughts, or are they coming from somewhere else? Are you generating them or channeling them? The distinction becomes harder to maintain. The confrontation happens in August at a cafe on Brigate you've started frequenting because your flat feels too small, too full of shadows. You're nursing a tea and pretending to read a paperback when he slides into the seat across from you. No preamble, no asking permission, just sits down, fixing you with those flat eyes, and starts talking. He says he's found more of your work. Pages blowing down streets, tucked into crevices, as if the city itself is distributing your ideas. He's collected them, he says, with the careful reverence of a disciple gathering scripture. And they've given him guidance, clarity, a sense of purpose he'd been lacking his whole life. You should leave, should stand up, knock the table over if necessary, and get the hell away from him. But you don't. Because part of you, a part you're ashamed to acknowledge, wants to hear this. Wants to know that your words mattered, that they had power, even if that power manifested in the worst possible way. So you sit there, tasting the bitter tea, your heart pounding so hard you're sure he can see your chest shaking, and you listen as he explains how your explorations of alienation spoke to his own experience. How your metaphors about silencing chaos gave him permission to act on impulses he'd been suppressing. How reading your words felt like looking in a mirror and finally understanding the reflection. The worst part, you do see yourself in him. The same frustration with a world that doesn't operate according to any sensible rules. The same barely contained rage at institutions that promise order but deliver only corruption. The same desire to impose meaning where none exists. He's not a monster. He's not some supernatural evil. He's a man with a pathology that rhymes with your own, and the resonance makes you feel sick. You try to tell him he's misunderstood your work, that it was exploration, not advocacy, but the words sound hollow even to your own ears. Because weren't you in some dark corner of your mind advocating? Weren't you saying that some people deserve to be silenced, that certain forms of chaos merit violent correction? You were just writing it, not doing it. But is that distinction meaningful? Does intent matter if the outcome is identical? He leaves eventually after extracting a promise from you that you'll keep writing, keep exploring those themes he finds so illuminating. You nod numbly, unable to form words, and watch him disappear into the afternoon crowds. Then you sit there for another hour trying to reconstruct your self-perception from the fragments he's left behind. Are you an artist exploring dark themes, or are you an accomplice, a muse for murder? The question has no good answer. Back at your flat, you pull out every notebook, every draft, every scrap of paper with your handwriting on it. You spread them across the floor like a case file, which in a way they are. You're investigating yourself, looking for the moment where your exploration of alienation became a recipe for harm, looking for the exact phrase or passage that could have tipped someone over the edge from thought to action. And you find them, not one moment but dozens, passages about control, about silencing. About women as symbols of social breakdown, about the Yorkshire landscape as a stage for moral correction. Each one defensible in isolation, each one part of a legitimate exploration of dark psychology, but together they read like an instruction manual for the attacks you know are happening. The fog is rolling in when you hear the news bulletin on the radio. Another attack. This one in Manningham, near a factory you used to walk past on your way to interviews. The details are sparse, victims' rights and all that, but the reporter mentions something that makes your blood freeze. The woman survived, gave a statement to police, said her attacker seemed to be following a script, that he muttered something about purging the stain before he struck, purging the stain. That's from an idea you had last week, an idea you didn't write down because it felt too explicit, too dangerous. An idea you kept locked in your head where it should have been safe. But somehow, impossibly, it's escaped. It's out there in the world, in the mind of a man who's turning your unwritten thoughts into scars on living flesh, and you realize with creeping horror that the connection between you might be deeper and more inescapable than mere influence. The unwritten idea, that's what breaks you. Not the letters, not the confrontations, not even the cafe conversation where you saw yourself reflected in a killer's eyes. No, it's the fact that a thought you kept locked inside your skull somehow escaped and became violence in the real world. How? The question consumes you through the autumn of 1976 and into the strange, schizophrenic spring of 1977, where Britain celebrates the Queen's Silver Jubilee with bunting and street parties will. Yorkshire bleeds. The contrast is obscene. You watch from your window as your street hangs red, white, and blue decorations, neighbors laughing and toasting the monarchy while the evening papers stack up on your floor, each one documenting another attack, another woman fighting for her life, another family torn apart. The Jubilee feels like a national delusion, a desperate attempt to pretend everything's fine while something rotten festers in the shadows. You don't attend the parties. Can't stomach the forced cheerfulness when you know what's happening in the dark spaces between the celebrations. When you know your words, your ideas, are part of what's happening. Because they're spreading, your writings, not through any mechanism you can identify or control, but spreading nonetheless like a virus finding new hosts. You first notice it in May when a phrase you wrote 2 years ago appears as graffiti on a wall in Hare Hills. Then again, different phrase, different location. A pub toilet in Armley, a bus shelter in Headingley. But it's not just graffiti anymore. You overhear conversations in queues, in pubs, men talking in low voices about certain women, certain behaviors, using language that sounds familiar. Your language. twisted slightly, coarsened, but recognizably yours. You want to scream at them, ask where they heard those words, but you're afraid of the answer. Afraid they'll say they don't know, that the ideas just came to them, like they're floating in the air itself. Then your journals start changing. You notice it one morning in June when you're reviewing old entries, trying to map the progression of your thoughts, trying to find the exact moment you went from exploration to inspiration. An entry from 1975, one you remember clearly because you wrote it the night after your mother's funeral, now contains paragraphs you don't recognize. Whole sections about divine mission, about being chosen to cleanse, concepts you've never entertained because they're too grandiose, too detached from the psychological realism you've always pursued. You tell yourself you're misremembering, that grief warped your recollection of what you wrote. But then it happens again. An entry you read just last week now contains alterations, subtle ones. A word changed here, a sentence added there, each modification pushing your original thoughts towards something more actionable, more explicit. You start erasing entries, whole pages, tearing them out and burning them in the sink. But they come back, not immediately, but within days. The pages reappear in your notebooks, the words return like they were never gone, and you begin to doubt whether you erased them at all. Are you losing time, having blackouts where you rewrite your own history? Or is someone else doing this? Breaking into your flat while you sleep, while you're at the pub drowning your guilt, replacing your journals with edited versions designed to drive you mad, both explanations terrify you. Both suggest a loss of control so complete that you can't trust your own mind or your own space. The introspection becomes obsessive. You pace your flat for hours, the floorboards creaking a rhythm of accusation, trying to dissect your motivations with the precision of a coroner. Where does the rage in your words come from? Is it truly yours, born from personal grief and economic desperation and the slow grinding down of hope, or is it something inherited? A curse of the times, as if the 1970s itself has produced a collective pathology and you're just one of many vectors. Your mother died angry, you remember that. Angry at the world that gave her so little, angry at systems that failed her, angry at her own body for betraying her. Did you absorb that anger? Are you channeling it, transforming her unspoken fury into your elaborately articulated rage? And if so, if your motivations are rooted in unaddressed grief, does that make you more or less responsible for what happens when someone acts on the words that grief produces? The typewriter becomes a source of dread. It sits on your desk like a mechanical oracle, keys clacking like accusations every time you use it. Each stroke feels like a potential spark, a small explosion that could ignite something terrible miles away in someone else's mind. You've stopped writing fiction entirely, haven't produced anything new in months. But you can't seem to throw the machine away, can't disconnect from the habit of putting fingers to keys, even if all you produce now are fragmented questions and circular self-interrogations. He finds you again in July. You're at a different pub this time, the shoulder of mutton in Kirkstall, thinking distance might provide safety, but he tracks you down like he's been following you all along. Maybe he has been, the thought no longer surprises you. He sits down uninvited as before, but this time he's agitated, excited. His eyes have a fevered quality that makes your skin crawl. He needs to share something with you, he says, a vision he had, and then he describes it. A scenario so detailed, so specific, that you feel the air leave your lungs, because he's paraphrasing your prose, not word for word, but close enough that there's no mistaking the source. He's describing a passage you wrote about the Yorkshire moors as a place of purification, about fog as a cleansing agent, about the necessity of removing corruption to reveal underlying purity. Except you never showed him that passage, never showed anyone. It lives in a journal you keep under your mattress, wrapped in a pillowcase, specifically because it felt too revealing, too dangerous. You interrupt him, demand to know how he knows about that writing. He looks confused, says he doesn't know what you mean. The vision came to him, he insists, came fully formed like divine inspiration. You argue, your voice rising above the pub din, telling him those are your words, your ideas, and he couldn't possibly have received them through any legitimate means. He just stares at you with those flat eyes and says, maybe the ideas came to you both. Maybe you're both receiving something larger. That possibility, that you might be conduits rather than sources, is somehow worse than any alternative. It suggests an impersonal force at work, something beyond individual pathology, a kind of ideological contagion that uses minds like radio receivers. You leave the pub shaking and you make a decision. The manuscripts have to burn, all of them. Every notebook, every draft, every scrap of paper with your handwriting on it. If the ideas are spreading, you'll eliminate the source. Cut the head off this thing before it grows any larger. Back at your flat, you gather everything. Years of work. The only evidence that you ever tried to be something more than another invisible person ground down by circumstance. You pile it all in the metal bin you keep for rubbish, douse it with lighter fluid, and strike a match. The flames climb quickly, pages curling and blackening, and you feel a mixture of relief and loss so acute it's like cutting off a limb. But as the fire peaks, as the smoke rises and fills your flat with the smell of burning ambition, you see something. Words appearing in the flames, not consumed by them, but revealed. Hidden messages written in some kind of invisible ink, activated by heat. Phrases you've never seen but recognize as V. Aerations of your thoughts, instructions, coordinates, names, and standing outside your window silhouetted against the streetlight is a figure watching, waiting, as if the burning was expected, as if it's all part of a pattern you're too close to see. The flames die down, but the figure remains, and you realize with crystallizing horror that destroying the manuscripts isn't an ending. It's a choice, a crossroads. And both paths ahead are marked with blood you may have already spilled, leading deeper into a darkness that knows your name and has been waiting for you to step willingly into its embrace. The figure outside your window doesn't move, doesn't knock, just watches as the flames die down and the hidden messages fade back into ash. You stand there frozen, clutching the edge of your desk, trying to understand what you just witnessed. Words appearing in fire, instructions you never wrote, a watcher who seems to know this moment was coming. The choice crystallizes in your mind with brutal clarity. This isn't ending on its own, you have to act, but which action? Which path through the darkness that swallowed your life whole? By 1978, Yorkshire has transformed into something unrecognizable, or maybe it's just revealed what it always was beneath the surface. The investigation has dragged on for 3 years now, the police know closer to catching the Ripper, and society is fracturing under the pressure. Women don't walk alone after dark anymore. Not anywhere, not ever. Curfews have been implemented, not officially, but through collective understanding that certain hours belong to predators now. The pubs empty early, the streets turn into ghost towns after sunset, and in the vacuum of official protection, other forces emerge. Vigilante groups, men with baseball bats and self-righteousness patrolling neighborhoods, stopping anyone who looks suspicious, which in practice means anyone they don't recognize or don't like. The cure becoming as frightening as the disease. You watch this transformation from your flat, from pub corners, from factory floors, and you can't shake the feeling that you're watching your words made manifest in ways you never imagined. The paranoia, the division, the creeping authoritarianism of communities policing themselves. These aren't direct quotes from your journals, but they're extensions of the themes you explored. Society breaking down, trust eroding, the center not holding. You wrote about these concepts as observations, warnings maybe, and now they're real. Their structure, their policy, and the weight of that realization sits on your chest like a stone. The moral dilemma keeps you awake nights. You've narrowed your options to 2. First option, confront him directly. Find Sutcliffe wherever he is and tell him to stop. Tell him he's misunderstood your work, that he needs to turn himself in, that you'll go to the police yourself if necessary. Make him see reason if reason exists in a mind that's already crossed lines you've only written about. The appeal of this option is control, direct intervention. The fantasy that you can undo what your words have done through more words, better words, corrective words. But you know how naive that sounds even as you consider it. What makes you think he'll listen? What makes you think you have any authority over him beyond the accidental authority of inspiration? Second option, anonymous tip. Call the police, tell them what you know without revealing your role in it. Give them his name, his patterns, whatever information you've pieced together from your encounters and the news reports. Let the system handle it. Remove yourself from direct culpability while still taking action. The appeal here is distance, safety, the possibility that you could help stop the killings without admitting how deeply you're entangled in their origin. But this option carries its own horrors. What if they ask how you know? What if the tip leads them back to you, to your writings, to the trail of influence you've left across Yorkshire? What if helping means destroying yourself? You stand at a literal crossroads one rain-soaked evening in March, the kind of Yorkshire rain that doesn't fall so much as hover, soaking through everything with patient malice. You're outside the police station in Millgarth, phone box 20 yards to your left, road leading toward Bingley where you know he drives his routes, 30 yards to your right. One step in either direction feels like rewriting reality or condemning it. Your vision blurs, whether from rain or tears or exhaustion you can't tell anymore. And you realize something that makes your stomach turn. Both paths require you to understand his motivations. Both paths require you to think like him, which means both paths pull you deeper into the very pathology you're trying to escape. That's when the echoes start, not supernatural. Nothing so clean as ghosts or visions, just your words bouncing back at you from everywhere. You hear them in conversations you pass on the street. A man telling his wife that certain types of women bring trouble on themselves. Your metaphor, crudely simplified but recognizable. A group of teenagers spray painting a wall with phrases about cleansing the streets. Your language, your rhythm, third hand and poisoned but unmistakably descended from your journals. A radio talk show where a caller describes the killer as bringing order to chaos. Your exact phrase. You want to scream that these aren't supernatural manifestations, that they're just the normal horrifying process of ideas spreading through a culture, but it doesn't matter. The effect is the same. Your thoughts have become impersonal forces, self-replicating, beyond your control, shaping reality in ways that would be fascinating if they weren't so devastating. You start methodically exploring both options in your mind, gaming out scenarios with the obsessive detail you once reserved for fiction. If you confront him, what happens? Best case, he stops, turns himself in, confesses. Your role remains hidden and the killing ends. But probability? Low, more likely he reacts violently. Either toward you, seeing confrontation as betrayal, or toward others, accelerating his timeline because the window is closing. Or worst case, he convinces you that you're both right, that the work should continue, and you become not just inspiration but accomplice. Active participant. Your refusal to join him might be the thing that tips the balance, makes him more dangerous, more unpredictable. Blood on your hands either way. If you tip off the police, what happens? Best case, they catch him quickly, the killing stops, your identity remains protected. But probability, also low. The police have been chasing leads for 3 years. They're overwhelmed, understaffed, working with investigative methods that feel medieval. Your anonymous tip might get lost in the noise or might lead to increased surveillance that spooks him into hiding, prolonging the terror. Or worst case, they trace the call, investigate you, find your journals, and you become not just suspect but primary suspect. They've been looking for someone to blame, someone to relieve the pressure. A writer with disturbing content and suspicious knowledge would fit perfectly. Your attempt to help might frame you for murders you inspired but didn't commit, a distinction that might not matter in court. Then you discover something that reframes everything. It's late April, you're sorting through old family documents you've been avoiding since your mother's death, and you find a photograph. School picture from 1958. You recognize yourself immediately, gap-toothed and awkward. But there's another boy in the frame, standing 3 rows back. You squint. The beard is gone, the features younger, but the eyes are unmistakable. Him, Sutcliffe. You were at the same school. Not friends, you don't remember ever speaking to him, but you shared the same space, breathed the same air, absorbed the same environment. This coincidence could mean nothing. Yorkshire isn't that large, people overlap. But then you remember other details, the school's reputation for strict discipline that bordered on abuse. The headmaster who believed correction came through humiliation. The atmosphere of suppressed rage that permeated every corridor, you both came from that. Both absorbed that particular poison. Both transformed it into something that leaked out later in different forms. Writing for you, action for him. The shared childhood trauma amplifies the existential threat you've been trying to ignore. What if your connection isn't about inspiration at all? What if you're both products of the same toxic soil, and the mirroring between your work and his actions isn't influence but parallel evolution? 2 responses to the same fundamental wound, finding each other across time because the patterns were always going to align. This realization should complicate your choice, but instead it clarifies something. Tipping off the police anonymously is cowardice. It's pretending you're separate from this, that your role is incidental rather than fundamental. If you're truly connected, if there's something shared at the root of both your pathologies, then confrontation is the only honest option. You need to face him. Need to see if understanding can lead to cessation, or if understanding will only reveal how deep the rot goes. So you make your choice, you're going to find him, going to meet him on neutral ground and lay everything out. The influence, the guilt, the shared past, the hope that acknowledgement might break whatever cycle is spinning here. It's probably stupid, probably dangerous, but it's the only path that doesn't feel like running. The meeting unfolds in ways you didn't anticipate. You arrange it through a note left at the pub, knowing he'll find it because he always seems to find everything related to you. You suggest a lay off the Manningham route, industrial area, quiet but not isolated enough to make you completely vulnerable. He agrees, shows up exactly on time, gets out of his truck with an expression that's almost peaceful. And as you start to speak, to explain, to argue for stopping, he smiles. Actually smiles. Because he's been waiting for this, he says, waiting for you to finally admit what you both know, that you're not victim and inspirer, you're collaborators, partners in something larger than either of you understood. And the way he says it with such calm certainty makes you wonder if he's right, if confrontation was never going to be salvation but final surrender. As the darkness closes around you both, as his words blur the lines you thought were solid, you realize the true horror isn't that you inspired a killer. It's that you might have found your mirror, and in that reflection, the question of who inspired whom dissolves in the fog-shrouded air between you, and you realize with creeping certainty that maybe inspiration was never the right framework. Maybe what you've stumbled into is something more fundamental, something older. Two people shaped by the same broken system, expressing their damage in parallel forms, finding each other not through causation but through resonance. And that thought is somehow more terrifying than simple guilt. He suggests moving somewhere less exposed. The labie suddenly feels too open, too vulnerable to passing headlights and questions you're not ready to answer. You agree, though every instinct screams that following him anywhere is madness. But you've come this far. Backing out now feels like cowardice, and you need to see this through, need to understand the full scope of what your words have unleashed or reflected. So you get into your car and follow his truck through the labyrinthine streets of 1979 Bradford, through neighborhoods that feel like they belong to a different country entirely. Yorkshire has transformed in the months since you last paid attention, or maybe you've just finally noticed what was always building. The surveillance state has metastasized from concept to structure. Cameras appear on every corner, though whether they're functional or theatrical you can't tell. Neighborhood watch patrols march through streets with armbands and clipboards, stopping anyone who looks suspicious, documenting movements, creating logs that feed into some central database nobody quite understands. The media frenzy around the Ripper case has given authorities carte blanche to implement measures that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Curfews, checkpoints, mandatory registration of anyone fitting vague profiles that seem to shift based on political convenience. Your writings about control and order have somehow become policy, and the irony isn't lost on you. You wrote about these dystopian possibilities as warnings, and society responded by treating them as instruction manuals. He leads you to an abandoned warehouse near Thornbury, one of those hulking industrial corpses that litter Yorkshire's landscape, monuments to economic decline and broken promises. The fog is thick here, almost solid, turning the streetlights into diffuse halos that illuminate nothing. You park beside his truck and follow him inside, the metal door groaning like it's in pain. The interior is vast and empty, your footsteps echoing in ways that suggest you're being listened to by the space itself. Broken windows let in streaks of sickly orange light. The air smells of rust and rot and something organic you can't identify. He turns to face you in the center of the warehouse floor, and his expression is strange. Not threatening, not exactly. Something closer to gratitude, relief. He tells you he's been waiting for this conversation for years, waiting for you to finally understand. Your words, he says, gave voice to his silence. Before he found your writings, before phrases from your journals started appearing in his awareness like gifts from the universe, he was just noise. Chaotic impulses with no structure. Rage without vocabulary. You gave him language, you gave him framework. You gave him permission, though you never meant to, and that accidental permission was more powerful than any intentional instruction could have been. You stare into his eyes, and the horror isn't that they're alien or inhuman. The horror is that they're familiar. You see your own suppressed rage reflected back. The same frustration with a world that promises meaning but delivers only grinding absurdity. The same desire to impose order on chaos, to make something stop. The difference, the only difference, is that he crossed the line from thought to action, and you stayed on the safe side of metaphor. But the impulse. E is identical, the pathology is shared. And standing here in this warehouse that feels like a confessional and a courtroom and a tomb all at once, you have to ask yourself, is inspiration just another word for complicity? The decision point arrives like a physical presence in the room. You can feel it pressing down, demanding choice. Option 1, try to reason with him. Explain that he's misinterpreted your work, that exploration isn't advocacy, that the distance between writing about violence and committing violence is the distance between humanity and monstrosity. Appeal to whatever capacity for reason still exists in his mind. Maybe, just maybe, if you can articulate the distinction clearly enough, he'll stop. He'll see that he's taken your metaphorical explorations and made them literal in ways that betray their intent. This option requires you to expose your own pathology, to admit how deep your explorations went, to reveal that the line you're defending is thinner than you'd like to admit. But it's honest. It's confrontation in its purest form. Option 2, flee, get out of this warehouse, drive straight to the police station, tell them everything you know. Give them his name, his patterns, his confessions. Let the authorities handle it, even if that means risking self-incrimination in a world where thoughts are increasingly policed, where your journals could be evidence not just of inspiration but of conspiracy. This option is practical, safe relatively, but it also feels like abandonment. Like running from a mirror that's showing you something you desperately need to see, even if the sight makes you sick. The dystopian reality of modern Yorkshire makes both options feel impossible. If you reason with him, you're confessing complicity to the one person who can't be trusted with that information. If you flee and report, you're entering a system that's become paranoid and punitive, where your writings would be analyzed by people trained to see connections and conspiracies, where distinguishing between thought crime and actual crime has become increasingly difficult. The impersonal forces of collective paranoia have made everyday interactions feel scripted, and you realize with mounting dread that conversations you've overheard, phrases you've noticed aren't random. They're your words, circulating, spreading, being policed. The surveillance state isn't just watching actions, it's monitoring ideas, and your ideas are the infection they're trying to contain. You navigate this realization like walking through the fog outside, each step revealing new horrors. The rain-slicked streets of your memory feel contaminated now, every whispered conversation a potential echo of your journals. The grounded realism of your situation, no supernatural escape hatches, no convenient villains to blame, makes it worse. This is human pathology in its purest form. Two men shaped by circumstance and choice, standing in a warehouse, trying to figure out where one's influence ends and the other's agency begins. The immersive terror of it wraps around you like the cold metal of the warehouse door behind you, your heartbeat syncing with his in ways that feel biological, inevitable. You choose reason, not because it's safe, but because fleeing would mean accepting that understanding is impossible, that the mirror he's holding up shows nothing worth examining. You choose to believe that articulating the distinction between thought and action matters, that words can undo what words have done. You take a breath, taste the warehouse air thick with decades of industrial residue, and start to speak. Start to explain the difference between exploring darkness and embracing it. Start to argue that your shared pathology doesn't mean shared responsibility. Start to draw the line you've been defending internally for years. And that's when his response shatters everything. He smiles, not the peaceful smile from earlier, but something sharper, more knowing. He tells you he's been waiting for you to claim that distinction, waiting for you to argue that writing about murder is different from committing it, because he has something to show you, something that will redefine your understanding of your role in this nightmare. He reaches into his jacket pocket, pulls out a notebook. Your handwriting, but not quite. Pages you don't remember writing, filled with details too specific to be metaphor. Addresses, times, methods. A blueprint you supposedly created but have no memory of producing. And as he flips through the pages, reading your words back to you, words that describe attacks that happened exactly as written, you realize the fragile boundary you've been defending might not exist at all. That the line between inspiration and instruction, between thought and action, between you and him, has been dissolving for years. And you're only now seeing the truth, standing in a warehouse at the end of 1979, holding a mirror that reflects not two separate people but one fractured pathology expressed through two different vessels, neither of whom can claim innocence, neither of whom can escape the gravitational pull of what you've both become. The notebook trembles in your hands, or maybe it's your hands trembling around the notebook. The distinction feels meaningless as you stare at pages filled with your handwriting describing attacks in forensic detail, attacks that happened exactly as written. You don't remember producing these pages. The dates don't match any fugue states you're aware of, but the handwriting is yours. The syntax is yours. The obsessive attention to psychological motivation is unmistakably yours. He watches you process this, and his expression carries something close to sympathy, as if he understands what it's like to wake up and discover you're not who you thought you were. By 1980, Yorkshire has descended into something approaching collective psychosis. The Ripper case drags into its fifth year, and the prolonged terror has transformed society in ways that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. The curfews aren't optional anymore. 8 post-Meridim, the streets empty like someone pulled a plug. Blackouts roll through neighborhoods on schedules that seem designed to maximize fear, plunging entire districts into darkness for hours at a time. Your motifs of purging the night have been literalized by a city that's decided if women can't be safe in darkness, then darkness itself must be controlled, contained, rationed. The irony would be funny if it wasn't so horrifying. But the worst part, the thing that makes you question whether you're still sane or whether sanity has become irrelevant, is the cult. You first hear about them in March. A group calling themselves the Night Scribes, 20 or 30 people, maybe more, who have started ritualizing your writings. They meet in abandoned buildings, read passages from your journals like scripture, discuss interpretations like theologians debating sacred texts. They've somehow acquired copies of your work, possibly the same way Sut. Lifted through mechanisms you still don't understand, and they've built an entire belief system around your explorations of alienation and control. They don't kill, as far as anyone knows. They just worship the idea of killing. They've turned your metaphors into mythology, and in doing so they've made you into something between prophet and monster. Standing in the warehouse, clutching the impossible notebook, you feel the weight of this twisted legacy crushing down. Sutcliffe says he's been in contact with them, says they revere you both, see your partnership as inevitable, sacred even. And then he makes his proposal, the pact. His voice is calm, almost businesslike as he lays it out. Option 1, you co-author an ending. Work with him to stage a final act that's so perfect, so complete in its symbolic resonance that it closes the narrative loop. After that, he stops. The killings end. Your influence gets its culmination, and you both walk away knowing you've left a mark on history that will never be erased. He says it like he's offering you a career opportunity, a chance to take ownership of your impact rather than hiding from it. Option 2, embrace what you are. Accept that you're not a writer who accidentally inspired violence but an architect of cultural shift. The cult proves your ideas have power beyond what you imagined. Society has reorganized itself around your concepts. Why fight that? Why pretend you're separate from the force you've unleashed? He can show you how to cultivate that influence, how to guide it without direct participation, how to become the voice that shapes minds that shape actions. You'd be insulated, protected by layers of interpretation and plausible deniability, but your impact would multiply exponentially. Both options make you physically ill, but as he talks, as he articulates these paths with chilling logic, you feel something shifting in your understanding of yourself. Memories surface. Flashbacks to moments you've tried to forget. Your mother's funeral, standing in rain-lashed cemetery, feeling rage so pure it tasted metallic. Not grief, rage, at her for dying, at yourself for not preventing it. At a universe that promised meaning but delivered only randomness and rot. You remember going home that night and writing for 6 straight hours, producing passages about control and punishment that felt like they came from somewhere outside you, channeling through you. The impersonal force of unchecked emotion, grief transformed into something harder and more dangerous. You relive other moments, losing your job at the newspaper because your articles were too dark, too focused on society's failures rather than its recoveries. The editor calling your work obsessive, unhealthy, saying you wrote like someone who wanted the world to burn. You remember feeling vindicated rather than chastened, feeling like you were seeing clearly while everyone else lived in denial. That vindication, that certainty that your darkness was actually clarity, maybe that's where the real pathology took root. Not in the writing itself, but in the pride you took in going further than others dared. In being willing to explore what polite society refused to acknowledge. The realization hits like a physical blow. Your motivations weren't pure exploration. They were weaponized grief, rage dressed up as analysis, a desire to make the world hurt the way you hurt. And if that's true, if your foundation was always rotten, then maybe the distance between you and Sutcliffe isn't about action versus thought. Maybe it's just about courage versus cowardice. He had the courage to act on what you both felt. You just hid behind the pretense of art. You need to make a decision. The notebook in your hands is evidence, concrete proof of your connection to the killings, but evidence of what exactly? Of inspiration, of conspiracy, of split personality producing murder blueprints you don't remember writing. You could destroy it, tear it up, burn it, scatter the ashes, eliminate this link between you and him. Then destroy everything else, every journal, every draft, every scrap of your handwriting. Erase yourself from this story. Let him be the sole monster, while you fade into obscurity and try to rebuild something resembling a clean conscience. Or you could use it, keep the notebook, add to it, create a false trail that leads investigators to him through breadcrumbs you intentionally leave. Play the concerned citizen who discovered this conspiracy and brought it to light. It's risky, requires you to be convincing under scrutiny, but it's possible. You could trap him using his own confession, his own twisted pact proposal as evidence of his sole guilt. Salvation through betrayal, redemption through manipulation. Both paths require you to investigate your own mind with the same methodical attention you once gave to fictional pathologies. You spend days after that warehouse meeting reviewing your entire mental history, cataloging every thought that crossed the line from observation to advocacy, every moment where empathy for darkness became identification with it. You conduct this investigation in safe houses, dingy hotel rooms where you register under false names, places with dim lighting that plays tricks on your perception. Shadows move in your peripheral vision, not supernaturally but through exhaustion and paranoia, your mind creating threats because it's learned to expect them. The horror is grounded entirely in psychology, in the terrifying realization that you can't trust your own memories or motivations. Then the twist emerges, slow at first like fog creeping through streets, then undeniable. You're meeting with a police detective, a formality because they're interviewing anyone connected to locations where the Ripper has struck. The detective asks routine questions about your movements, your observations of the neighborhood, and then he says something that stops your heart, a phrase from your writing, exact wording. The detective doesn't attribute it to you, uses it like common parlance, like everyone's been saying it. You test this, drop another phrase from your journals into conversation, and the detective nods, says yes, that's the prevailing theory among the investigative team. They're thinking with your thoughts, using your frameworks. The investigation itself has been colonized by your ideas without anyone realizing the source. You clutch the incriminating pages in your coat pocket, the ink seeming to smudge like blood under your sweating palms. His voice echoes in your head, the packed debate continuing even though you're miles from the warehouse. The psychological intrusion feels total, complete. You're not separate from this anymore if you ever were. And as you make your choice, as you decide whether to destroy or deploy the evidence, whether to accept the pact or fight it, something shifts in the fog-thick streets outside. A figure emerges. Not Sutcliffe, someone else. Someone you recognize from old photographs, from repressed memories, from a past you thought had no connection to this present horror. And their presence reshapes everything you thought you understood about the chain of events, about who inspired whom, about whether this story started with you at all, or if you've been following a script written by someone else entirely, pulling you toward a reckoning that was always inevitable and always designed to destroy everything you thought you were. The figure stepping from the fog shouldn't be possible. The face belongs to someone you haven't seen in over a decade, someone who died, or so you thought. Your former writing mentor from university, Professor Eleanor Marsh, stands under the streetlight looking exactly as you remember her, maybe older by a few years, but unmistakably alive when the obituary you read in 1974 said otherwise. She smiles, and it's not a friendly smile. It's the smile of someone who's been waiting for this exact moment, who's orchestrated moves on a chessboard you didn't even know you were playing on. And in that smile, everything you thought you understood about inspiration and influence shatters into fragments that cut deeper than any truth you've faced so far. 1980 reaches its endgame in the suffocating heat of late summer. The Ripper case has consumed Yorkshire for 5 years, but your private investigation has led you somewhere the police haven't looked. The revelation hits you like a freight train when Eleanor starts talking, explaining with the patient condescension of a teacher correcting a slow student. Sutcliffe wasn't the only one your writings touched. Your words, distributed through mechanisms you're only now beginning to understand, created a network. A web of individuals who read your explorations of alienation and control and heard permission. Not all of them killed, most didn't, but some acted in smaller ways, creating a pattern of violence that's been attributed to one man when it's actually dozens of scattered incidents unified only by ideological resonance. The whodunit dimension you've been missing suddenly crystallizes. The police are chasing a single killer, but what if the Yorkshire Ripper was never one person? What if your alternate timeline created something more insidious, a distributed pathology that hid in plain sight because everyone assumed monsters hunt alone? Eleanor explains this with academic precision, like she's defending a thesis. She shows you evidence, newspaper clippings of attacks that don't quite match Sutcliffe's pattern but echo your themes, different weapons, different victim profiles, but the same underlying philosophy of purging chaos through targeted violence. Some of the perpetrators have been caught, charged with individual crimes, while Sutcliffe remains free because the police keep attributing attacks to him that he didn't commit, creating a composite killer from multiple sources. The hoax tape that derailed the real investigation in our timeline. In yours, it's one of many false clues planted by this network, intentional misdirection inspired by your writings about the unreliability of truth in a corrupted system. You wrote about how society creates monsters to avoid confronting systemic failures. And somehow, impossibly, people took that as instruction to become those monsters, to prove your thesis through demonstration. The weight of this truth physically staggers you. If Sutcliffe is just one thread in a larger tapestry, if your influence created an entire culture of violence rather than inspiring a single killer, then the scope of your complicity expands beyond anything you've allowed yourself to imagine. But Eleanor isn't done. She asks a question that reframes everything. What if you confessed? What if you walked into a police station right now and told them everything, showed them your journals, explained the network of influence you've mapped? You play out the scenario in your mind, the decision branching into possible futures. Path 1, confession. The police turn on you immediately. Not because they believe you're the Ripper, but because you're confessing to thought crimes in a society that's grown paranoid enough to prosecute intention as heavily as action. Your writings become evidence not of inspiration, but of conspiracy. They arrest you, hold you in a cell that echoes with your own prose as detectives read your journals aloud, trying to extract confessions to specific crimes you didn't commit but can't prove you didn't enable. But in this path, something unexpected happens. A hidden ally emerges, someone working inside the investigation who's been tracking the same patterns you've noticed, someone who understands the difference between exploring darkness and embodying it. This ally, you imagine, would recognize that your confession is actually a key to unraveling the network, to understanding how ideology spreads and mutates. They'd protect you, use your knowledge while shielding you from prosecution, because stopping the killings matters more than assigning blame to someone who wielded a pen instead of a weapon. It's not redemption exactly, but it's survival with purpose. A path where your guilt becomes useful, where empathy gone awry circles back toward something resembling justice. The psychological horror of this scenario isn't in the violence itself, but in the realism of how quickly you'd be consumed by a system designed to find simple answers to complex questions. You feel the accumulated weight of every word you've written, every exploration of rage and alienation, pressing down like physical mass. Each memory becomes a thread pulling you toward confession or deeper denial. You remember writing about women who represented social breakdown, not because you believed it, but because you wanted to understand people who did. But intention doesn't matter once words leave the page. Impact is all that counts, and the impact of your explorations has been catastrophic. Alina watches you process this, and then she reveals why she's here, why she faked her death and tracked your work for over a decade. She was your first reader, she explains, the one who saw potential in your darkest explorations when you were just a student trying too hard to be provocative. She encouraged you, pushed you deeper, gave you the validation that made you believe documenting human pathology was a worthwhile pursuit. But she had ulterior motives. She was studying you, using you. Building a psychological experiment about how ideas transmit through culture, how one person's private darkness can become public nightmare if given the right conditions to spread. You were never the source. You were the test subject. A vector for ideas she planted, watching to see if they'd propagate beyond you. And they did spectacularly. Sutcliffe, the network of copycats, the entire dystopian transformation of Yorkshire, all of it orchestrated through you by someone who understood manipulation at a level you're only now beginning to grasp. The interrogation scene that follows isn't in a police station, but in her apartment, a space that feels like a combination of confessional and courtroom. She questions you methodically, dissecting your motivations with surgical precision. Why did you keep writing when you saw the first signs your work was influencing violence? Pride, you deem it, the intoxication of being taken seriously, of having impact in a world that usually ignored people like you. Why did you explore themes of punishing women rather than examining your own misogyny? Denial, you confess. It was easier to frame it as social critique than admit you harbored the same resentments you were supposedly analyzing. She strips away every defense, every rationalization, until you're left with the raw psychological truth. You wrote from a place of hurt that wanted to hurt back, empathy gone awry, as she puts it, the ability to understand suffering without the wisdom to not inflict it. You pace her apartment, your reflection fractured in windows that overlook fog-shrouded streets. The echoes of your prose mock you from memory, phrases you thought were insightful now revealed as symptoms of pathology you should have treated instead of cultivated. The atmospheric suspense builds not from external threat but from internal collapse, the realization that every choice you made led inevitably here, to this moment where someone else explains your life back to you with a clarity that feels like annihilation. This is grounded psychological horror at its purest. The terror of discovering you're not who you thought, that your self-perception was always fiction, and the real you is so much worse than you allowed yourself to see. But then Alina makes an offer. She can help you disappear, take you out of Yorkshire, give you a new identity, let you start over somewhere your words haven't poisoned the soil. Or she can help you stay and fight, use your understanding of how the network operates to dismantle it from within, working with that hidden ally in the police to actually stop the killing rather than just reassigning blame. Both options come with costs. Disappearing means abandoning any responsibility for the chaos you've created. Staying means risking everything for a redemption you might not deserve and might not achieve. She gives you 48 hours to decide, and as she speaks, you realize something that makes your blood run cold. The hidden ally she mentioned, the person inside the police investigation who supposedly understands the difference between inspiration and action, it's her. She's been working both sides, guiding the investigation while guiding you, controlling the narrative from every angle. The revelation fractures your understanding of agency itself. Have you made any real choices, or have you been following a script she's written from the beginning? And as that question settles like poison in your mind, she tells you there's one more twist. One final piece of information that will redefine everything you think you know about how this started and why. She reaches into a drawer, pulls out a folder thick with documents, and the look on her face tells you that whatever's inside will shatter any illusions you have left about your role in this nightmare. Your heart pounds as she slides it across the table toward you, forcing one final heart-pounding choice: to open it or to refuse, to know the full truth or to cling to the last vestiges of ignorance that might be the only mercy left available in a world that's revealed itself to be far darker and more deliberately constructed than you ever imagined possible. Your fingers hover over the folder, trembling with the weight of a choice that feels simultaneously monumental and meaningless. What difference does knowing make when you've already lost control of the narrative? But you open it anyway because humans are programmed to seek understanding even when ignorance might be mercy. The documents inside steal your breath: medical records, psychiatric evaluations, all bearing your name, all dated from periods you have no memory of. Diagnoses of dissociative identity disorder. Treatment notes describing sessions where you, or someone wearing your face, discussed elaborate fantasies of creating cultural contagion through written word. And then the revelation that cracks reality like dropped glass. Eleanor Marsh died in 1974. You attended the funeral. But the woman sitting across from you isn't Eleanor, she's a construction. A manifestation of your own splintered psyche, given form and voice by a mind that fractured under pressures you've spent years refusing to acknowledge. The room shifts, or your perception shifts. Eleanor's face flickers like a projection losing signal, and you see underneath. Not another person, but an absence. A space where your consciousness created something to externalize the guilt and manipulation you couldn't admit came from within. You've been talking to yourself, all of it. The confrontations, the revelations, the offers of salvation or escape. Just different aspects of your fractured mind arguing with each other, trying to reconcile what you've done with who you thought you were. The psychological horror of this realization is so complete, so total that you laugh. Because what else can you do when you discover you're not just complicit in inspiring a killer, but possibly are the killer, acting through dissociated states you can't remember, creating personas and networks and entire conspiracies to avoid facing the simple, brutal truth that your words and your actions might have been the same thing all along. But that's not even the final twist. The folder contains one more document, a police report dated 2 weeks ago. They've found your journals, the ones you thought were hidden, locked away, destroyed. Somehow they've surfaced, and the investigative team has attributed them to Sutcliffe. They think they've found his manifesto, his ideological framework, the writings that explain his motivation. Your prose, your explorations, your psychological depth, all reassigned to the man you thought you inspired. The whodunit flips entirely. In this timeline, you're not the inspirer, you're the ghost, the invisible author whose work has been claimed by someone else, who's taking credit for your pathology while you fade into irrelevance. Or maybe it's more complex. Maybe Sutcliffe found your writings and adopted them so completely that the line between your authorship and his appropriation dissolved, creating a composite killer whose thoughts are yours but whose actions are his. And the police, desperate for answers, have stitched these elements together into a narrative that satisfies their need for simple causation while missing the horrifying truth of distributed responsibility. The decision crystallizes with painful clarity. You can fight this accusation, prove the writings are yours, reclaim authorship of ideas that have birthed nightmare. But the evidence supporting this path seems to vanish even as you consider it. The journals shift in the folder, pages rearranging themselves, or maybe your memory of what they contained warps in real time. Fighting means asserting you're the source, which makes you either conspirator or killer depending on which dissociated version of you the court believes. Or you can submit, accept that the writings have been reassigned, let Sutcliffe be the author, fade into the background as just another reader who misunderstood along with everyone else. This path opens something unexpected. Redemption through anonymity. If you're not the source, you can't be blamed for the spread. You become another victim of the ideology rather than its architect. The dread of this choice is balanced by strange hope. Maybe surrendering the narrative is the only way to ask. A bit. But as you weigh these options, you realize something deeper. Your pathology, the drives that pushed you to explore alienation and control in such vivid detail, wasn't rooted in destruction. It was a cry for connection. A desperate attempt to articulate isolation so profound that putting it into words felt like the only alternative to disappearing entirely. You wrote about rage because you were drowning in rage. You explored violence because violence felt like the only language that could pierce through the numbness modern life imposed. Looking back through the methodical self-investigation you've been conducting for months, reviewing journals and memories and fractured timelines, you see the pattern. Every dark exploration was preceded by moments of profound loneliness. Every violent metaphor emerged from periods when human connection felt impossible. You weren't trying to hurt people. You were trying to be seen. To be understood, to find someone else who felt the same existential weight you carried, and in the worst possible irony, you succeeded. Sutcliffe saw you, understood you, connected with your work in the most devastating way imaginable. The historical timeline asserts itself through the chaos of revelation. In the real world, Sutcliffe was captured in January 1981. But in your alternate timeline, something has prevented that capture. And you realize with creeping horror that the something is you. Your influence, spreading through culture like a virus, has taught people, including investigators, to think differently about violence, about motivation, about the relationship between individual pathology and social sickness. The police are looking for a monster, but your writings have convinced everyone that monsters don't exist, that there are only broken systems producing broken people. This philosophical shift, born from your need to be understood, has made Sutcliffe uncatchable. He's not hiding better. Society has just lost the ability to see him clearly, to draw the lines that would make capture possible. Your cry for connection has become a shield for a killer, and the weight of this unintended consequence crushes down like physical force. The suspenseful chase begins not externally but internally. You run through Yorkshire's underbelly, both literally through rain-slicked streets and metaphorically through the landscape of your own mind, trying to find a version of yourself that isn't compromised, that hasn't been colonized by the very pathology you meant to examine. You race through fog-enshrouded hideouts, places where your consciousness has stored memories you couldn't face. Each revelation peels back another layer. A conversation you had with Sutcliffe that you don't remember. A journal entry describing plans that match actual crimes. A letter you apparently wrote to police, misdirecting their investigation because some part of you wanted to protect the connection you'd finally found, wanted to preserve the only person who truly understood your work, even if understanding manifested as murder. Your thoughts race faster than your feet. Every step is a battle against the realization that you've inspired not just violence, but an entire infrastructure of denial that makes stopping violence impossible. But there's empowerment here too, hidden in the horror. If you created this, you can uncreate it. If your narrative shaped culture, you can reshape it. The methodical investigation of your own fragmented psyche reveals tools you didn't know you possessed. Alternative versions of yourself, dissociated personas born from trauma, each holding pieces of the puzzle. Some want redemption, some want destruction. One just wants to sleep. And in negotiating with these aspects of yourself, in reclaiming the scattered fragments of your consciousness, you start to see a path forward. The fog clears in patches, revealing Yorkshire streets you recognize from childhood, before everything became complicated, before words became weapons. You're near the place where Sutcliffe drives his roots, and you realize this isn't coincidence. Your fractured mind has been leading you here to the origin point, to the moment where you can finally choose who you want to be. Not who circumstances made you, not who trauma shaped you into, but who you consciously decide to become. The empowering revelation counters the horror with something approaching grace. You're not predetermined, the narrative isn't fixed. Even now, even after everything, change is possible. But as you stand at this crossroads, rain plastering your hair to your skull, breath coming in ragged gasps that taste of iron and regret, the ultimate twist strikes. Sutcliffe steps from the shadows ahead of you, but he's not alone. He's with someone who looks exactly like you. Another dissociated fragment made flesh, or maybe the real you while you're the fragment, or maybe something more ontologically disturbing where the distinction has become meaningless. And in that moment, watching yourself stand beside a killer in the Yorkshire night, every line you've tried to draw between inspiration and action, between thought and deed, between guilt and innocence, blurs into irrelevance. The final stand demands not choosing between good and evil, but choosing which version of yourself will survive, which fragment gets to claim the title of real, knowing that whatever choice you make will determine not just your fate, but the fate of every person whose life has been touched by the darkness you helped unleash into a world that never asked for your particular brand of understanding. Seeing yourself standing beside a killer does something to your perception of reality that can't be undone. The rain continues to fall, and you're paralyzed by the fundamental question of which one is real. Are you the fragment watching, or are you the fragment standing there in the shadows with Sutcliffe's hand on your shoulder like your old friends? The other you, the one standing with him, looks more solid somehow, more certain. less fractured by doubt and guilt. And that terrifies you more than anything else in this nightmare. Because what if the version of you that embraced the darkness is the authentic one, and you, the one trying to hold onto morality and accountability, are just the echo, the illusion consciousness created to maintain the fantasy of innocence? But then Sutcliffe speaks, and his words cut through the ontological confusion like a blade through fog. He tells you both to follow him. There's something you need to see, something that will clarify everything. And despite every instinct screaming to run, to get as far from this moment as possible, you follow. Both versions of you follow. Through rain-soaked streets that feel like they belong to a different century, past buildings that loom like tombstones, until you reach the derelict mill at the edge of Bingley. The structure is skeletal, most of its roof missing, walls pocked with decay. Storm clouds gather overhead with theatrical timing, and thunder rolls across Yorkshire like the earth itself is groaning under the weight of what's about to be revealed. Inside, the mill is a cathedral of industrial ruin. Broken machinery lies scattered like the bones of some extinct species. Water drips through gaps in what's left of the ceiling, creating rhythms that sound almost deliberate, almost musical. Sutcliffe leads you to the center of the space where he set up something that looks like a shrine. Your writings, all of them. Pages pinned to beams, spread across rusted equipment, arranged in patterns that suggest meaning you're not sure you want to understand. And in the center of this paper temple sits a single chair, and in that chair sits your journal. The original. The one you started in 1973 when everything was simpler, when writing was still just writing and not weaponized consciousness. He explains, and his voice carries a strange gentleness. You and him, you're not cause and effect. You're psychological twins, 2P. Opal shaped by identical traumas, responding to identical pressures, developing identical pathologies in parallel. The shared childhood at that brutal school. The similar family structures, mothers who died angry, fathers who were absent even when physically present. The same economic desperation, the same feeling of being ground down by systems that promised prosperity but delivered only grinding disappointment. You both turned to dark exploration as a way of making sense of senselessness. The only difference was medium. You chose words. He chose actions. But the impulse, the underlying motivation, the rage and grief and desperate need for control in a world that felt increasingly chaotic, that was identical. The revelation doesn't absolve you. If anything, it makes the guilt sharper. Because if you're twins, if you're mirrors, then everything he did was everything you were capable of doing. The line you've been defending, the distinction between thought and action, feels thinner than ever. But Sutcliffe offers something unexpected. Hope. He tells you that destroying the writings could end it. Not magically, not through some supernatural mechanism, but psychologically. The writings have become a symbol for him and for the network of others who have found inspiration in your work. They've become permission structures, intellectual frameworks that allow people to act on impulses they'd otherwise suppress. Remove the symbol, break the permission, and the ideological support collapses. People would still have the impulses, but without the elaborate justification system you've built, acting on those impulses becomes harder. Guilt reasserts itself. Conscience finds purchase again. But destroying the writings means destroying yourself, or a version of yourself. Everything you've thought and felt and tried to articulate for nearly a decade reduced to ash. It means erasing your identity, or at least the identity you've built through your work. The you that remains after that erasure, who would that even be? The decision crystallizes in front of you like ice forming on glass. Option 1, destroy everything. Watch your words burn. Risk becoming nobody, blank space where a person used to be, but potentially stop the killing, break the chain of influence. Option 2, preserve the writings but contain them. Lock them away somewhere they can't spread further. Keep your identity intact but live knowing that the horror you helped create still exists, dormant but not dead, waiting for the next person desperate enough to find meaning in darkness. The other you, the one that's been standing silently beside Sutcliffe, finally speaks. And hearing your own voice come from outside yourself creates a dissociation so complete you feel like you're floating. The other you argues for preservation. Says that erasing the writings doesn't undo the harm, doesn't bring anyone back, just makes you feel better while accomplishing nothing. Says that the real courage is living with what you've created, bearing witness to the damage, using that knowledge to prevent future harm rather than pretending you can reset to innocence through destruction. It's a seductive argument, one that appeals to your desire to believe you're still valuable, still capable of good, even after everything. But you see the trap in that logic. The trap of believing you're special, that your continued existence matters more than stopping the spread of poison. And you remember something from early in this journey, before the fractured timelines and dissociated personas made everything impossibly complex. You remember why you started writing in the first place. Not to hurt, not to inspire violence, but to connect. To find someone else who felt the same existential weight, and you found them. Found hundreds of them, maybe thousands, people who resonated with your articulation of alienation. The tragedy is that connection manifested as collective pathology instead of collective healing. But the impulse underneath, the desperate human need to not be alone in your pain, that was real. That was valid. And maybe destroying the writings is the final act of connection. The admission that some pain shouldn't be shared, that some articulations of darkness create more harm than the silence they break. You look at Sutcliffe, really look at him for the first time without the layers of projection and denial. And you see what he said is true. He's a mirror. The unhealed wounds in him are the unhealed wounds in you. The difference is you're at a crossroads where you can still choose healing, however incomplete, however compromised. He's past that point. The question is whether your choice can pull him back or whether you're about to follow him over the edge. The psychological depth of this moment, the recognition of mutual vulnerability, the chilling reminder that humanity's edge between civilization and horror is so much thinner than anyone wants to admit, it's almost too much to process. But you have to process it, because the decision can't be delayed any longer. Thunder crashes overhead as you reach for your journal. The hammer Sutcliffe placed on the table beside it, heavy industrial thing covered in rust, feels like it weighs 1,000 pounds when you pick it up. You grip it, feeling the weight of every word you've written, every exploration of darkness, every moment of pride when you thought you were being brave by going where others feared to tread. The sirens in the distance are getting closer. Someone must have reported activity at the mill. Time is collapsing. The other you, the one standing with Sutcliffe, shakes their head, begs you not to do this, says you'll regret erasure, that you'll spend the rest of your life feeling like a ghost in your own body. And maybe that's true, maybe destruction will leave you hollow. But looking at the pages spread throughout this ruined mill, at the testament to how your need to be understood metastasized into something monstrous, you realize hollow might be an improvement. You bring the hammer down on the journal. Once, twice. Pages scatter, spines break. The other you screams, and the sound is so raw, so visceral that you almost stop. But Sutcliffe does something unexpected. He helps. Starts gathering pages, feeding them into a barrel where someone, maybe him, maybe one of your dissociated fragments, has already started a fire. The flames climb hungry and bright, and as your words burn, as the elaborate architecture of justification and exploration crumbles into ash, you feel something inside you crumble too. A version of yourself dying in those flames. But underneath the grief of that death, underneath the terror of becoming nothing, there's something else. Relief, release. The possibility, however faint, that without those words circulating through culture like a virus, the chain of inspiration might finally break. That Sutcliffe, watching his permission structure burn, might find it harder to continue. That the network of admirers might lose their scripture, and without it, might find their way back to doubt, to guilt, to the ordinary moral constraints that keep most people from crossing into irredeemable darkness. The fire rages as the storm intensifies, rain pouring through the broken roof, creating steam where it hits flames. The sirens are close now, maybe a minute away. The other you has stopped screaming, faded to translucence, and you realize the integration is happening. The fragments remerging. The various versions of yourself collapsing back into Somme. Everything singular, however damaged. Sutcliffe watches the fire with an expression you can't read. And as the last pages curl and blacken, as the final words disappear into smoke and heat, as your choice resolves in fire and rain, you feel the lingering echoes of your influence beginning to settle, not into resolution exactly, but into something that might, with time and effort and more sacrifice than you can currently imagine, eventually approach something resembling peace, or at least the exhausted quiet that comes after long war. When the fighting stops, but the scars remain to remind you of everything that was lost and can never be recovered. The smoke clears, both literally and metaphorically, and you're left standing in the ruins of a derelict mill with ashes drifting around your feet like snow. The sirens arrive. Police swarm the building. They find Sutcliffe compliant now, the framework that justified his actions reduced to cinders. They find you covered in soot and rain, looking like you've been through a war, which you have. A war fought entirely in the realm of ideas and influence, where the casualties were real but the battlefield was consciousness itself. The killings stop. Not immediately, but within weeks. The network you inadvertently created, the night scribes and scattered admirers who found permission in your words, they fragment without their scripture. Some fade back into ordinary lives, their dark impulses contained by the return of doubt. Others seek new justifications, new frameworks, but without your particular articulation of alienation, the ideology doesn't cohere. It fractures, weakens, eventually dissolves. But you're changed. forever marked by the journey from 1974, when you were just someone trying to make sense of grief through writing, to this moment where you've burned your own identity to stop a horror you helped create. Think about where we started. Your words meant as exploration, sparking something in Sutcliffe's mind that transformed observation into motivation. The moral dilemmas you faced, each choice revealing how thin the line is between understanding darkness and enabling it. The psychological twists that forced you to confront your own fractured consciousness, to acknowledge that you weren't separate from the pathology you examined, but intimately, terrifyingly connected to it. And finally, the climactic confrontation where destroying your life's work became the only path to reclaiming agency, to breaking the chain of influence before it consumed everything. The real Yorkshire Ripper terrorized England from 1975 to 1980, murdering at least 13 women before Peter Sutcliffe was finally caught. Our timeline asked the question, what if you were the one who inspired him through your writings in this alternate reality? What if your unintended influence created not just one killer, but a network, a culture, a distributed pathology that reshaped society? The horror wasn't supernatural. It was profoundly, devastatingly human. The exploration of extreme human pathology, the psychological depth and motivation, the grounded realism of how ideas spread and mutate and become something their creators never intended. That's the true terror. Not monsters in the shadows, but the monstrous potential in ordinary thoughts left unchecked. You walk the now quiet streets of Yorkshire in the months that follow. The fog still rolls through. The rain still falls with that particular British persistence, but something has shifted. Women walk home at night again, slowly, cautiously, but they walk. And you carry the knowledge of what your words were capable of, the damage inspiration can cause when it finds the wrong audience. But here's the empowering truth you've discovered through this nightmare. Words can heal as much as harm. The same capacity for influence that created horror can create hope. You've learned to be more careful, more conscious, more aware of how articulation shapes reality. Not to stop writing, but to write with wisdom earned through terrible experience. Yet the atmospheric unease never fully leaves. Because here's the question that should keep all of us awake sometimes. What inspirations lurk in your unspoken thoughts? What ideas are you harboring that, if expressed without care, could become something you never intended? We all carry darkness. The question is what we do with it, how we channel it, whether we let it define us or whether we face it, understand it, and choose something better. If this psychological depth and motivation journey through alternate timeline horror chilled you to the core, hit that like button. Subscribe to Midnight What Ifs for more what if history explorations where real events meet fictional twists. Share this with friends who love true crime with psychological depth, who appreciate atmospheric horror grounded in human pathology rather than supernatural escape hatches. And comment below, seriously, I want to know. Would you dare write your darkest ideas knowing they might take on lives of their own? What would you do if you discovered your words had inspired something terrible? These aren't just hypothetical questions. They're invitations to examine your own relationship with creativity, with influence, with the responsibility that comes from putting thoughts into the world. Stay curious, horror fans. Stay vigilant, history buffs. Stay conscious of the power language holds to shape reality in ways we can't always predict or control. The next What If awaits in the shadows of history, and I'll be here at midnight to explore it with you. Until then, remember, the most terrifying stories are the ones that could actually happen, the ones where the monster is just a person who made different choices, who listened to different voices, who found justification in ideas that should have remained warnings instead of becoming blueprints. Sweet dreams, or maybe not. Maybe just conscious ones.